The priest held the future prince in both hands and fully immersed him in the icy water. After the solemn baptism ceremony ended, the priest carefully placed a necklace of love around the infant's neck, symbolizing the child's rebirth and commitment to a new life. However, when the priest turned to the princess and invited her to receive the same ritual, she politely declined, claiming that her mysterious energy was powerful enough to protect her, as she was the reincarnation of a former witch and possessed mystical powers. The priest sternly warned the princess that if she refused to undergo the ceremony, she would never be truly recognized as a woman. He further emphasized that if she was not considered a real woman, then her child would be deemed illegitimate and would never be granted the title of the future prince. These words instantly enraged the princess, and without hesitation, she stripped off her clothes, leaving everyone around her in utter shock. As the prince rushed to find the princess, his subordinates held him back tightly, but his loyal guard didn't hesitate to leap into the water and began a desperate search. At that moment, a familiar figure appeared on the other side of the water. Without delay, the prince boarded a boat in search of the princess, but as night fell, they still found no trace of her, and those around him kept reminding the prince that they might never find her because the princess was not human. Meanwhile, the young prince reached the age where he needed to be breastfed, but he refused to drink from anyone else. One of the maids suggested trying to feed him deer milk, but the prince firmly rejected it. The cries of hunger from the little prince, in his soft and fragile voice, pierced the father's heart like a sharp knife, and the once proud man couldn't hold back his tears. The poor little prince was so hungry that he mistook his father's finger for a nipple and sucked on it with all his strength. During the search for the princess, one of the guards collapsed from the severe cold and lay beneath an ancient tree, when suddenly, the princess appeared at his side. She leaned down, gently removed the hat from his head, and softly blew a warm breath into his ear. With that warm breath, the guard's lips began to tremble slightly, and his consciousness slowly returned. The princess whispered that she would help drive away the wolves that threatened him and show him the way home, but the guard urgently told her that her child was in danger and on the brink of starvation, and these words stabbed into the princess's heart like a sharp blade. The next day, overwhelmed with concern for her child, the princess decisively returned to the kingdom, but due to prolonged exposure to the cold, she fainted as soon as she arrived. The prince and the maid acted quickly, applying warm ointment all over her body in hopes of dispelling the chill. After a brief rest, the maid carefully brought the little prince to the princess, and he began to nurse from his mother's breast. At that moment, the young prince was finally back in his mother's arms, enveloped in deep maternal love. The maid witnessed this touching and heartwarming reunion and was overjoyed for them. Several years later, an envoy sent by the prince was brutally tortured to death in the Grand Duchy of Moscow, and they received a provocative letter from a Psycha. Although the prince had longed for peace, this time he could no longer endure the insult and decided to prepare for war and lay siege to the city. Once the preparations were complete, the prince led his troops toward the Grand Duchy of Moscow, vowing to capture a Psycha. As the prince departed, the princess and the young prince watched him fade into the distance, while the maid also couldn't hide her sorrow for the one she loved, all of them uncertain whether they would meet again. But just a few days after the prince's departure, a messenger from Moscow got drunk and caused a commotion, prompting the princess to decisively douse him with a bucket of cold water. But the messenger only became more brazen, daring to pick up the princess in his arms. This outrageous act completely enraged her, and she turned around, slashing deep bloody marks across his chest. Her fury triggered a terrifying transformation. She reverted to her original form. The messenger, stricken with fear, fainted on the spot. Meanwhile, the prince stood gazing at the battlefield across from him, the depth of his eyes reflecting the grim struggle between offense and defense. In that moment, the prince made a critical decision. He would wait for the blizzard to strike, for only then would they stand a chance of breaking through the tightly sealed gates. After a long and grueling wait, the storm finally arrived as expected. Seizing the opportunity, they quickly built a makeshift cart. Despite the bitter cold, they pressed on with unwavering resolve, pushing the cart step by step through the harsh conditions. The steep slope was covered in a thick layer of ice, slick and gleaming like a mirror. Every step was taken with extreme caution, always aware of the danger of slipping. Their swords became lifelines, stabbing into the ice to anchor their footing and resist the force pulling them downward. Amidst this brutal environment, they demonstrated incredible perseverance and unyielding spirit. Moving forward without pause, they finally reached the city gates undetected. Taking advantage of a moment of negligence from the guards above, The drills in their hands roared like beasts craving freedom, furiously tearing into the heavy wooden doors, but the sharp noise of drilling pierced the silence like an alarm, alerting the guards overhead. The guards shouted down and gave the order to unleash a barrage of arrows. The drill managed to bore a large hole into the gate, and they quickly inserted a flexible spike-shaped tool. Just as they were about to strike the locking bar free, the soldier operating it was hit by an arrow. Another guard stepped forward bravely, undeterred by the danger, but he too was struck by an arrow. Even so, he summoned the last of his strength and broke the locking bar. Using the downhill force and the momentum of the cart, they managed to push the gate open. At that critical life-or-death moment, he blew the horn of victory with his final breath. Hearing that familiar signal, the rest of the troops charged in like unleashed tigers, storming into the city without hesitation. In the midst of this fierce battle, the prince finally found Asaika, the enemy he had long sought. With the help of a general, he successfully captured Asaika. However, the journey home proved even more treacherous than the path they took to reach the city. Hunger and freezing winds hung over them like two deadly blades. At that same time, the messenger wounded by the princess rushed to find the priest, claiming she was a witch. To prove his words, he revealed the wounds on his body and begged the priest to punish her. Back at the palace, the little prince was happily playing in a room when the unexpected arrival of strangers startled him. One of them rushed inside and carried the boy away, declaring that the princess was to be imprisoned until the prince returned, and that the child must be taken from her. Just as they were about to leave, the door froze shut under the princess's control. They couldn't get out. The priest then opened the door himself and ordered them to let the child go and leave. Though still confused, his assistant obeyed and set the boy down before leaving. As the priest was about to enter, the princess slammed the door shut in his face. After a brutal battle, the brave prince defeated Asaika of the Grand Duchy of Moscow and brought him back as a prisoner. But the journey home was riddled with suffering, as relentless frost and savage blizzards mercilessly assaulted them. Hunger and cold left them with nowhere to hide, and the wounded and frail struggled in the freezing winds, clinging desperately to life. Packs of wolves roamed the land, tearing apart the fallen corpses. The injured soldiers knew in their hearts that they might never make it home, but they refused to become a burden to their comrades. In helplessness and despair, they walked one by one into the icy caves, choosing to end their lives, an act of tragic sacrifice that was deeply heartbreaking. After enduring countless hardships, the prince and his men finally returned to their homeland. People poured out of their homes to welcome the heroes who had survived the trials of war. But the prince had only one thought in his heart. He anxiously searched the crowd, longing to see the princess, yet she was nowhere to be found. A man beside him quietly told him that the princess had locked herself in her room for nearly 6 months. Hearing this, the prince felt as if his heart had been pierced with a knife. Unable to wait another moment, he rushed to the one who had been on his mind day and night. When he opened the door, the sight before him shattered his heart. The princess curled up in a corner of the room, clutching a smoking pipe in her hand, her expression blank and lifeless. Seeing this, the prince's eyes filled with tears. When the princess saw him return, the pipe slipped from her fingers. The pain in her heart was indescribable. She looked at the scars on his body, tears brimming in her eyes. She poured out the torment and helplessness she had endured in his absence, beating her fists against his chest in grief. But beneath the anger and pain was a deeper longing and love for him, and the two embraced tightly. They were reinforcing Asaika's chains. When the prince brought the princess outside, Asaika's gaze instinctively turned to the princess, while she, slightly afraid, leaned against the prince's shoulder because she had once rejected Asaika's proposal. The prince made a solemn promise to the princess, swearing that he would never leave her side again. But she questioned him. Why did he never listen to her? Why did he bring Asaika here? There was a hidden truth in her voice, a secret she couldn't speak aloud. At that moment, a man caught a glimpse of the princess's stunning figure. He saw her elegantly wave at him, and a mysterious force seemed to pull him forward, compelling him to walk toward her room. His every move was clearly seen by the prince's guards. Meanwhile, the prince was in deep discussion with the duke about military strategies when a loud commotion broke out outside. The prince stood up at once and went to see what was happening. His guard was fiercely whipping the man, every strike landing with precision.
Не я это, князь. Не я. Это она оморочила, приворожила. Ведьма она, князь. Ведьма.
The prince returned to his chambers and questioned the princess about why she hadn't made a sound. She calmly replied that she wasn't afraid of the guards. The prince began to suspect that the princess had cast a spell on the man. In frustration, he told the princess that if they were to live together, he would need more strength to withstand the pressure from the outside world. But he felt lost. Unsure whether his wife was just an ordinary woman or a witch with magical powers, his words were filled with doubt. The Duke made a final proposal to the prince, urging him to join forces in a war against two powerful duchies. He warned that if the prince refused, his witch wife and innocent child would fall under the enemy's blade. The Duke promised to wait 5 days, giving the prince time to decide. The prince knew this was a monumental choice, one that would affect not only his family but the fate of his entire duchy. After deep contemplation, he ultimately chose to reject the Duke's offer. Upon hearing the prince's decision, the atmosphere turned cold, and the meeting ended on a sour note. The prince knew that an attack from Moscow was now inevitable. When he called upon allies, only Svyashenik responded and brought his cavalry. The other strongholds refused to join in the attack. The prince went to see the imprisoned Asaika and spoke to him.
Ты убил моего отца моей жены, еще 1000 отцов, матерей, братьев и сестер. Ты сам дьявол.
Asaika's heart trembled at the prince's words, thinking that his life was about to end, but unexpectedly, the prince spared him. He told Asaika that the princess didn't care about who was right or wrong, she only needed someone who could protect her, and that someone was Asaika. The prince's words were firm and resolute. He made Asaika remember clearly he owed the prince his life, and that life was now to be used to protect the princesses. Outside, the princess had already prepared the horses, but the prince's heart was filled with sorrow and conflict. He knew she had to leave. For her safety, he had no choice, but as she was about to mount the horse and ride away, he could no longer suppress the deep ache of longing and love in his heart. The little boy looked back several times at his parents, never realizing that those few fleeting glances would be their final farewell. The woman anxiously warned the man that the enemy forces were about to launch an attack, but he, full of confidence, declared that he and his men could withstand any assault. Yet his stubbornness and overconfidence ultimately led to an irreversible tragedy. His wife and son perished in the flames of war. In overwhelming grief, he personally buried his wife and child, and resolved to seek out the Ural prince who had once extended an invitation he had refused. He led his brothers to the Ural fortress, and with their arrival, the dark clouds of war began to gather over the stronghold. To ensure the safety of the young prince, the princess, and all the women and children, the Ural prince made a wise decision to secretly relocate them to a hidden and secure place. But on that very day, enemy bombardment rained down mercilessly, plunging the fortress into chaos. The defiant Svyashenik fiercely opposed the prince's strategy to retreat behind the inner wall, insisting that such a move would never lead to victory. Yet the prince did not adopt his suggestion. Meanwhile, the opposing duke launched a heavy artillery barrage against the prince's fortress, trying to provoke a counterattack. Svyashenik, brimming with confidence, claimed that his forces outnumbered the enemy several times over and proposed sending in cavalry to trample the enemy lines, followed by infantry to finish the battle. The prince, however, firmly rejected this plan, believing it would only lead to pointless loss of life. Svyashenik mocked the prince for being cowardly and insisted on launching the cavalry assault. The prince, unable to stop him, reluctantly agreed to open the gates, but they did not expect that this was exactly what the Duke had planned. As soon as they stepped out, they were met with a devastating artillery attack, suffering heavy casualties. Still, they pressed forward, and the infantry followed close behind, but the outdated cannons couldn't keep up with the cavalry's speed, and the rate of fire was far too slow to support their charge. Just as the cavalry neared the enemy line, the enemy swiftly pulled back, seemingly in retreat, but this was only part of their strategy. At a signal, Russian troops who had been lying in ambush behind the artillery positions suddenly emerged, aiming to wipe out the Ural cavalry in one decisive strike. The Shavoda Frize, ancient defensive spikes, dealt a devastating blow to the Ural cavalry, hindering their advance. As they struggled to navigate the obstacle, archers descended like grim reapers, and a rain of arrows caused even greater losses. But the Russians weren't finished. Their trap included a well-planned ambush along the Ural soldiers' retreat path, intending to annihilate them completely. Svyashenik, the Ural commander, saw the situation spiraling out of control and tried to lead a breakout with his remaining forces, but they were caught in Moscow's ambush and picked off one by one. Witnessing this, the prince felt immense sorrow, but it only strengthened his resolve to strike back. He quickly changed tactics, ordered his men to gather large amounts of charcoal, and prepared for a fire attack. As they approached the enemy's position, the prince gave the order, unleashing flames that engulfed the enemy camp in an instant. Amid the chaos and panic, the prince led his forces in a fierce charge, engaging in a life-or-death battle. This battle not only showcased the prince's brilliant tactics but also revealed his fearless courage and determination. At that moment, The Duke ordered a ceasefire and postponed the battle to the next day. Asika arrived at the prince's fortress and tried to persuade him to join his side, mentioning that the princess was doing well with them, but the prince replied that he was a son of Ural and would never flee in the face of war. That night, he dreamt of reuniting with the princess, but when he awoke, it was just a dream. The next day, the Duke's army successfully captured the prince's fortress. The soldiers prepared to ignite the watchtower with flaming arrows, but in that critical moment, a man appeared and stopped them, insisting on capturing prisoners alive and urgently asking for the princess's whereabouts. He had never given up on taking the princess for himself and decided to try persuading them personally. In the heat of battle, the prince and his guards became the final defenders.
Бросай меч, князь! Бросай, не то прибьем!
Да не сдастся он. Не сдастся.
Кончай его, брат!
Just as Russian soldiers prepared to shoot them down, the man shouted to capture them alive. As he tried to stop the attack, a bullet struck him, but his intervention saved the prince's life. After the prince was captured, the Russian king confessed his ambition to unite all kingdoms under one rule. After careful thought, the prince chose to compromise and accepted the king's conditions. He was sent to the new capital prepared for him by the duke, but unexpectedly, the prince firmly stated that he wished to return to Cherdon. He offered to leave his son behind as the next heir if the king only wanted the title. And so, the prince set out on the road back to his homeland, giving up his royal status to live as a humble farmer, tending the land he loved. When his children learned the news, they rushed to reunite with their father. Seeing his children again filled the prince's heart with unspeakable joy, and they embraced tightly. Word of the prince's return spread, and former subjects came forward to offer their support, eager to contribute to their leader's new life. At that moment, a cavalry unit rode toward them. Asika waved at the prince before riding off, leaving behind one lone rider. When this rider removed their helmet, the prince was stunned to see it was the princess.
Мама! Мамочка!
Their children ran excitedly to their mother, and the prince blinked, making sure it wasn't just another dream. At last, the family was reunited, and in that moment of warmth and joy, all the waiting and sacrifice had finally found their meaning. I'm a movie enthusiast. Thanks for watching. See you next time.